The flight attendant's hands trembled as she reached for the tray of champagne glasses. It was just another long-haul flight, another night of polite smiles and routine service, until her eyes locked onto the man in seat 2A. Her breath caught in her throat. The glass in her hand wobbled dangerously, but she steadied it before it could crash onto the aisle floor. She had to be seeing things. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be possible. The man sitting there, casually flipping through the in-flight menu, was someone she had buried 2 years ago, someone she had mourned, grieved, and forced herself to move on from. Her husband. The same strong jawline, the same piercing eyes that used to hold her in their gaze, like she was the only person in the world. He even had the same slight crease between his brows, the one that always deepened when he was deep in thought. But how? How could he be here, alive, on this flight of all places? She felt her pulse pounding in her ears, the world around her blurred, passengers chatting, the hum of the engines. It all faded into the background. For a split second, she forgot she was standing in the middle of a first-class cabin, on duty, expected to carry on like normal. Her grip tightened around the tray. This had to be a trick, a cruel look-alike, or maybe exhaustion was playing tricks on her mind. After all, she hadn't been sleeping well lately. The anniversary of his death had just passed, reopening wounds she thought had started to heal. And yet, there he was, breathing, existing, sitting in a seat booked under a completely different name, a name she had never heard before. She forced herself to take a shaky breath. She needed to think. If this was some kind of mistake, she had to clear it up. If this was real, she didn't even know what that meant. As if sensing her stare, the man, her husband, looked up. His eyes met hers, and for a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Then, something changed, a flicker of recognition. His expression tightened, but not in shock. There was no gasp of surprise, no stunned realization. Instead, there was something else in his face, something unreadable, controlled, almost prepared. And that's when the fear really sank in, because if he wasn't surprised to see her, that meant he already knew she was here. And if he already knew, she swallowed. The weight of 1,000 unanswered questions pressing down on her. What was going on? Who was this man? And if he was her husband, why had he let her believe he was dead? Her fingers felt ice cold as she clutched the tray, her heart pounding so hard, she was sure the other passengers could hear it. He was still staring at her, his expression calm, too calm. It wasn't the reaction of a man who just came face to face with his wife after being dead for 2 years. There was no shock, no rush of emotion, just an unreadable stillness. Like he had expected this moment. She wanted to speak, to say his name, Daniel, but the sound caught in her throat. What if she was wrong? What if this was just a man who happened to look exactly like her husband? But deep down, she knew. She had memorized every inch of his face, every detail of the man she had loved. This wasn't just a resemblance. It was him. "Miss, are you all right?" A voice snapped her back to reality. One of the other passengers, an older woman sitting across the aisle, was looking up at her with concern. She forced a smile, though her face felt stiff. "Yes, I'm fine. She swallowed hard, gripping the tray tighter. "Excuse me for just a moment." She turned quickly, moving toward the galley, desperate for a moment to think. But before she could take another step, a hand brushed her arm. Not forcefully, just enough to stop her. She turned back. It was him. His hand lingered for a second longer before he pulled away. His voice was calm, quiet. "Can we talk?" The air in her lungs froze. He wasn't denying it. He wasn't pretending to be someone else. He knew. Her mind raced. She should demand answers right then and there. She should scream, cry, ask him where he had been all this time, why he had let her suffer. But this was neither the time nor place. She could feel the eyes of the other first-class passengers on her, sensing the tension. She gave a small, stiff nod. After service, he hesitated, then nodded back. She turned and rushed to the galley, her hands shaking so badly she had to set the tray down before she dropped it. She leaned against the counter, her breaths coming fast. This wasn't possible. 2 years ago, she had stood at his funeral. She had watched them lower the casket into the ground. She had grieved, sobbed, tried to put the pieces of her life back together. And yet, here he was, breathing, real, and acting as if he knew she would be here. Tonight, she forced herself to focus on work, handing out drinks and meals, checking on passengers, anything to keep herself moving. But every few minutes, her eyes flicked back to 2A. He sat there quietly, sipping his drink, occasionally glancing at her, waiting. Finally, after the cabin dimmed for the overnight flight and most passengers settled into their seats, she knew she couldn't avoid it any longer. Taking a deep breath, she walked over. "We can talk now," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, rising from his seat. Somewhere private, she led him to the crew rest area, a small enclosed space where flight attendants took their breaks. It wasn't much, but at least no one else would hear them. The moment the door shut behind them, she turned to face him. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice shaking. His eyes darkened slightly, as if he had been expecting the question. "You already know the answer." "No, I don't," she snapped. "Because my husband, Daniel, died 2 years ago. I was at his funeral. I buried him. So tell me how you're standing here right now, looking exactly like him." He exhaled slowly. "I never wanted to hurt you." Her stomach twisted. That was the answer he was starting with. Not an explanation, not an apology, just that. "Too late," she whispered. He ran a hand through his hair, looking away for a moment before meeting her gaze again. "I can't tell you everything. Not yet." She let out a bitter laugh. "Not yet. You let me grieve you for 2 years. You let me think you were dead. I had to rebuild my life from scratch. And now you just show up, alive, with some new name and a first-class ticket, like nothing happened." He winced. "I know how it sounds, but I had no choice." She shook her head, her breath uneven. "No choice? What does that even mean?" He hesitated. His fingers twitched slightly, as if he was struggling with something. Then, in a quiet voice, he said, "I had to disappear. It was the only way to keep you safe." Her heart stuttered. "Safe from what?" His jaw clenched. "From people who would have killed us both if I hadn't." Her stomach dropped. She felt like the air had been sucked out of the tiny space. She searched his face, waiting for some sign that this was all a twisted joke, but there was none. His expression was serious, his eyes filled with something deep and heavy. "I can't say more right now," he continued, "but I swear I never wanted to leave you. I never wanted to hurt you. But if I hadn't, you wouldn't be alive right now." Her mind raced. None of this made sense. Daniel, her Daniel, had been a businessman. A successful one, sure, but he wasn't involved in anything dangerous. He wasn't the kind of man who would need to fake his death to keep her safe, unless there was something she never knew about him, unless their entire life together had been built on secrets. Her breath came out shaky. "You're asking me to believe that you faked your death to protect me from what? Some kind of threat. A threat I never even knew existed." His silence was answer enough. Tears burned the back of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had spent too long crying over him. Now she wanted the truth. "Why are you back now?" she whispered. Daniel hesitated. His eyes searched hers, as if weighing how much he should say. Then finally he spoke. "Because I made a mistake," he said. "And now they know you're alive." Her stomach twisted. "Who?" she whispered. The muscles in his jaw tightened. "The people who wanted me dead," he said. "And now they're coming for you too." Her blood ran cold. In that moment, she realized that this wasn't just about him returning. This wasn't just about heartbreak and unanswered questions. This was about survival. And she wasn't sure if either of them would make it through the night. Her breath caught in her throat. The air inside the small crew rest area suddenly felt too thin, too heavy with everything he had just said. "They're coming for me," she whispered, barely able to say the words. Daniel gave a slow nod, his expression grim. "They must have found out I faked my death. If they know I'm alive, they'll look for any loose ends. That includes you." Her heart pounded in her chest. This wasn't just a shocking reunion. This was life or death. And she had been completely unaware, living her life like everything was normal, while something dangerous had been lurking in the background. She took a shaky step back. Why now? Why after all this time? Daniel exhaled, rubbing his hand over his jaw. "I don't know exactly, but I got word that someone's been asking questions about you, watching you. I had to come back before it was too late." The thought made her stomach turn. Had she been followed? Had there been someone watching her in the past few weeks, and she never noticed? "I don't understand," she said, her voice trembling. "Who are these people? What did you do?" He hesitated for a long moment, then finally said, "It started with my company. The deals I made. I trusted the wrong people, and by the time I realized what was happening, it was too late." He met her gaze. "They wanted me dead to cover their tracks. I had two choices, die or disappear." Tears burned in her eyes. "And you didn't think I deserved to know the truth." His face twisted with regret. "If I had told you, they would have gone after you too. The only way to protect you was to make you believe I was gone." He swallowed hard. "But I never stopped watching over you. I made sure you were safe." Anger, grief, and confusion swirled inside her. It was too much, too big. Before she could respond, the intercom crackled overhead. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for landing." The moment shattered. She was still on duty, and in less than 30 minutes, the flight would land. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel looked at her with a seriousness that sent chills down her spine. "You have to come with me." She froze. "What?" "They know about you now. The second you step off this plane, you're a target." She shook her head. "I have a life here. A job. I can't just disappear." His jaw tightened. "Neither could I. But I had no choice." He reached for her hand, his touch warm, grounding. "Please. I know it's a lot to ask, but I can protect you. Trust me. Trust." The words stung. For 2 years, she had lived believing a lie, mourning a man who was never really gone. Now, he was asking her to throw away everything she had built, to run with him into the unknown. Her instincts screamed at her to say no, to step away and walk out of this nightmare. But deep down, she knew something had shifted. If she stayed, she would never be safe again. She looked into his eyes, searching for something, anything, to tell her this was the right choice. And despite everything, despite the pain, the betrayal, the anger, she still knew him. The way he looked at her, the way his fingers curled slightly, like he was afraid she'd pull away, he was still Daniel, and maybe, just maybe, she still loved him. The final call for landing procedures echoed through the plane. She had seconds to decide. She took a deep breath. Then, with a quiet nod, she whispered, "Okay." Daniel exhaled, relief flashing across his face. As the plane touched down, she felt the weight of the moment settle over her. She wasn't just stepping off a flight. She was stepping into a new life, one filled with uncertainty, danger, and unanswered questions. But this time, she wouldn't be left in the dark. And no matter what came next, she was ready.